Okay, everybody, good morning or good evening to everybody. I guess it's some people's weekend. Today it's our. Can you hear us and is everything good? On our side, everything looks good. Okay, everything looks good. So I hope everyone's doing good today, and if it's a little bit late for some people, sorry about that. We wanted to be in this space. It's much easier to get a better angle for these kind of demonstrations rather than being in my normal studio. So today, basically what I'm going to be doing is going over how I'm using the NSK stones. And I'm going to go through some of the different grit ranges. So I'll just give you an idea of what I have in front of me today and kind of what I'll be working with. I decided to choose a few knives types that I regularly use. So today I have a single bevel. It's a old Fujiyama single bevel blue one. I have a Kaiju that I'm doing the rough work on currently. And I brought along a Tamahagane Honyaki Gyuto that I haven't started yet. And so I think I'll put this on the 200 as a demonstration. So those are the knives that I'll be using today. And the stones that I choose are some of the stones that I regularly use. Obviously, can't bring them all. So what I brought was 200 Oboro, a 400, that's a Hakuto 1. And then I brought two type of 800, the Oboro Bocho 800 and the Hakuto 1 800. And also one of my favorite stones, the 1500 and 3000S, the Hakuto 2. And then I also brought along a Oboro Bocho 2000 grit, and then the Hakuto 3, which is the softest of all the NSK stones, the Hakuto 3 12,000 grit. So those are some of the stones that I regularly use out of the NSK lineup. And then I got some of the dressing and flattening stones here, as well as the dressing stones that I use to maintain, and a glass plate that I used for lapping, and also some of the Nagura that I regularly use as well. So just a little bit about what kind of the schedule today and the things I'll be going through. So today I'm going to actually go through how I'm using the NSK stones, how I flatten and maintain them, how I do metate, and how I use the Nagura. And a lot of this is kind of reflecting the recent videos that were posted on Coleman's website and also on the Instagram page. I always get a lot of questions about these things, so I thought the best way to cover them would be through doing something like this. So I'll go do about a half an hour demonstration of what I'm doing, what I'm generally doing, what experience I've had with working with NSK stones. Then we'll go through about a half an hour of some of the questions that we got, and then half an hour to 45 minutes or so, we'll actually open it up to live to anybody that wants to ask some questions to me about their experience in NSK stones and other things. Okay, so I think we'll start now. I think everything is set up and ready to go. And if you guys have any questions throughout, yeah, you can just put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of my experience with using NSK and why I actually use them. I think one of the main reasons that I use NSK is the type of, good morning, good morning. Great to see you guys here, thank you. So, yeah, I've been sharpening for a very long time, actually, and people always joke about me, people that are close to me joke to me about that I have forgotten so many techniques more than most people know techniques. So, and yeah, that's probably true. And I'm always trying new techniques and trying to improve on things constantly, actually sometimes even daily. So NSK was a really unique experience and a really great opportunity to get into using NSK stones. And I had mentioned this before, that I've first started using NSK stones way back in the 2008, 2009, 10, around that time. I've knew about them. But when we were living in Kyoto, actually, I realized that NSK was actually in Kyoto. So we reached out to them and I started using some of the other stones that I thought were just for woodworking, really hard stones. And through time, we started developing some different type of stones with them that I thought would actually be great for actually kitchen knives. Now, just looking at one of the questions here, Piedre y Acero, I think I said that right. You're using Shapton 120 and Atoma 140. It really depends. I'm not really sure. It says I've been using Shapton 120, 140. I need to remove a lot of material. Do you think NSK would do a better job than the previous? It's a great question. For me personally, and I'll get into that when I start getting into the why I use the NSK stones. A lot of the very, very rough work, I find, if you can, and a lot of people can't, and I tend to go to using belt sanders with water, actually. So to actually remove a lot of the material, but I'm talking about knives that are coming straight from a blacksmith. So the NSK stones for me, after that, when I have the blade around 70% set, then I'll go to NSK 200. I try to get the blade set up as much as possible, but I know a lot of people don't have belt sanders or don't have access to these things. So it's difficult. If you really do find that you need to go that low to really remove a lot of material quickly, I think the NSK 200 can do the work. There's definitely techniques I'll go through today that I'll show you how to use the NSK for rough sharpening. But I think some work really needs to be done on a belt sander. There's no reason to really waste stone, and kind of that's my whole point. Another question, Shapton feels like sanding, Atoma diamond feels like cutting. How would that compare to NSK? I actually never use Atoma plates for removing material because the Atoma plates tend to wear out immediately. And you're just, I feel you're just really wasting money. So I don't tend to use Atoma plates. The thing about NSK is they cut fast, and if you use the proper techniques, you can kind of gauge and maintain the flatness easily. I've found before when I've used other brands in the lower grit ranges, one, I found that they don't cut very fast. They tend to lose the surface flatness very quickly. And they were very difficult to maintain flatness through the sharpening process, not just before and after, but really through the sharpening process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start showing you guys a little bit how I start sharpening on the 200 grit range. And I'll just take one more question before we start doing this. Mr. Easy, good morning, Ivan. What would be the main difference between the Hakuto 1 200 and the Boro 200 when doing rough sharpening in a polishing progression? Yeah, really interesting question. The Hakuto series was developed more for actually wide range of steels. So stainless steels, powdered steels, and different types of hyper steels, and carbon steels like blue super, and those steels that are really abrasive resistance or wear resistant. The Oboro Bocho series was created actually more for carbon steels, white 1, white 2, blue 1, blue 2, and a variety of other types of carbon steels that are in Japan. And really for working with, the Oboro Bocho is a bit harder than the Hakuto 2 series, but they do cut very differently. I tend to use both. And kind of when you get a personal relationship with the stones that you're using, you start really seeing these differences and how they affect. One example I can give is on the recent blade I finished, the Woots blade. From the blacksmith, I learned that was around 67 HRC. Using the NSK Oboro Bocho, a bit harder stone, I was getting tear out of the steel. When I switched to the Hakuto 1, actually it was no problem. So you really have to gauge on what you're doing. So let's start with some demonstration on how I do this. So I'm going to start with a 200 grit Oboro Bocho. Yeah, so I'm going to start demonstrating on the Oboro Bocho at 200, and the blade I picked today to kind of go through a bit of the sharpening process and how I maintain and use everything. I'm going to actually start with this Tamahagane Gyuto here, the Honyaki Gyuto. I haven't actually touched this blade, so it's quite thick. The sharpening on it and the shaping is from the blacksmith, Yamano. So it's not fully done. It's got a lot of work that needs to be done. Hours of work actually on the 200. So usually what I do first is to set the stone up. And how I do that, there's a few different ways you can do this, and I'll go through flattening first. So for flattening the NSK stone, it's really interesting. There's a few different ways you can do it and a few different approaches that I take. I tend to want to keep the blade, the stone, as flat as possible for the entire time I'm sharpening. I tend not to actually go at sharpening until it gets really worn out, and then it's really worn out, and then I have to go and do a lot of resurfacing and flattening. I tend not to sharpen like that at all. I maintain the flatness during sharpening. I just find that that helps the stone wear easier, and also the results that I get are much, much more crisp and clean on the blades that I'm working on. So there's a few different things you can use. Obviously, there's the NSK 200 grit flattener that you can start with, and that's a great and very effective way. I tend to reserve this for really specific techniques. So some of the things I use it for is, if the stone is fairly maintained well during sharpening, then the stone doesn't need a lot of flattening. So I tend to use this NSK stone for, I guess you could call it like light maintenance before and after I do sharpening. So basically just always rotate everything so you get even wear. And I like the NSK flatteners for actually doing the corners of the 200 grit, as well as the front. And remember to always wipe and clean all of this grit off, because they are very different from each other. And you don't want any grit contamination when you're doing polishing work. So I set the stone up like that. I mean, you can definitely use pencils and things like that. I tend to not use a pencil very much, just because I feel I have a pretty good relationship with the stone, that I can understand the high and the low spots from the wear of sharpening. So actually, let me move this out of the way a bit. So once I get the stone flat, then during sharpening, we'll go to a few different techniques that I use during sharpening and then after using a 200. Oh, Mark, hi, good morning. Hope you had a good weekend. Hope you got some fishing in, or some sharpening. Mr. Easy, how often do you find yourself flattening the NSK stones? You know, that's a really interesting question, very, very difficult to answer. It really has to do with what type and what shape and the geometry of the knife you're sharpening. I will say, if you're just doing edge sharpening only, very rarely. To give you an example, doing like 40 to 50, like only edge sharpening, I don't have to flatten the stone at all during that entire period. If I'm doing single beveled knives, because the bevels are flat, and I'm able to maintain a certain type of flatness during sharpening. The stones don't wear as much. But for something like this, where I'm doing a lot of shaping and it's a honbasuke shape, you do have to maintain and watch the flatness. But even that, I would say I don't flatten much. I don't have to flatten a lot. What I'm really focusing on usually is maintaining the flatness, rather, like I said, than wearing a big area out and then having to flatten that. I just don't want to go there. So I tend to really focus on maintaining the flatness. So, and I'll answer some other questions about that more later on. So there's a few things you can do too. I like to do before I start sharpening. I'll get onto the stone first. And right now the way I tend to start this type of blade is I work on the spine first. Because I really want to see where the spine is at in flatness. And obviously you can see there's areas of high and low spots that I've got to hit. So during sharpening, if you find sometimes that the stone is not cutting at the speed that you like, or you want to enhance the speed, depending on the type of steel or the blade that you're sharpening, there's a few easy things you can do. One is to use this small 120 brick that Coleman sells. It's a great device or great tool to bring back the cutting speed of the diamond stone. So how I do that is just so I go pretty aggressively with a lot of pressure. And usually that's enough to actually keep me going through an entire process of sharpening. So go back. So doing something like the spine like this, I don't find it tends to wear out the stone much. But when you're actually doing a lot of shaping of hamaguri and a lot of shaping of the entire blade, you really tend to have to maintain the flatness. But even then, I don't really find that I'm having to, for example, if I was using other stones like in the past at this grit range or even 400 grit range, I'd be flattening this probably every 4 to 5 minutes. But with NSK stones, I can go hours and sometimes not even flatten during one entire session. I do maintain the flatness, maybe out of habit, because it's just something I've always been kind of obsessed with. But I don't find myself having to really flatten like I used to. With other stones, honestly, to tell you the truth, I'm actually flattening sometimes more than I'm actually sharpening. With NSK, I'm sharpening more than I'm flattening, which is incredible. So let's get back to this. I think it's really important to, work around the stone. I don't tend to stay in one spot. And you really have to use your experience, intuition, sound, everything you have to really gauge the stone. I tend to also flip the stones quite regularly. And I'm actually using quite a bit of pressure, especially for this rough work. So you can kind of see what we've done so far. And obviously we just keep on going. So that's kind of how I set up and start using the NSK stone. So next, what I'll do, right now Yuka's just moving. We're just getting a better angle for you guys. Pietro, yeah, the scratches are very, very. Pietro Acero asks, scratches look pretty fine for a 200 grit. No, also looks like it removes a lot of material. The scratches are a very pure 200 grit. So often with other companies that I've tried, there's no regulation for what grit you put in there, as long as there's a certain amount of the stated grit. So a lot of times you find other grit in the stone, which causes deeper scratches or a very irregular looking scratch pattern. And yes, it removes a lot of steel very, very quickly. Japanese Knife Studio. Hey guys. Sorry being late, hectic Monday. Yeah, no problem. Take your time. I know what it's like to run a shop. So yeah, it does remove a lot, and it does remove a lot of steel quickly. Probably a blade like this, doing the entire surface, I could do in a few hours. But I tend to actually, I'll, especially with Honyaki, I'll be going on this side, often checking the straightness and then switching to the other side to maintain the straightness of the blade, as Honyaki and single bevel and almost every type of knife tends to move a lot. So I tend to flip back and forth. So as I move through the sharpening process, at this point, after a half hour, an hour or so, again, really out of habit and wanting to always maintain the stone surface, I'll just take this large brick here, also at 120 grit. And I use this for a few different reasons. It's not actually to bring up the cutting speed, but I actually use this to maintain the flatness. And these are very inexpensive. They're quite thick. They don't bother the diamond abrasive at all. They're just really cutting the base of the stone. So how I use this during sharpening is just like that. I'll just, because it's wide and flat, and check the flatness. Visually, you can usually tell, and it looks good, feels good. You can also tell how the stone feels. Are there any high or low spots? And I do this light maintenance throughout the sharpening process. It's hardly hard to say how much I do it, because I do it almost out of habit. But it really actually, I find for me, actually helps to maintain the stone wear very, very efficiently. And at the same time helps keep the flatness and also can bring up a bit of the cutting speed as well to the 200 grit, the 400 grit as well. I use this, and sometimes even I'll use it on the 800 grit, depending on the type of steel or knife I'm sharpening that day. Jonathan Gui, good morning, Jonathan. Hello, Ivan and Yuka. Could you perhaps show a before and after comparison of an NSK in a loaded burnished state, cutting performance versus after it's been refreshed? Yeah, of course. Let me see which stone we could do that. Well, we'll move on to the 400 grit stone, and then we can probably demonstrate that better there. So that's kind of how I work with a 200 grit stone. I just try to keep it maintained as much as possible. Other details like the corners and edges, even during sharpening, if I see anything getting too flat or too on an angle, I'll always smooth everything out. It becomes a habit, I guess, when you've been doing this for such a long time. But I found that for me, the NSK stones have lasted a long time. I definitely have gone through them because I do a lot of sharpening. But for the amount of sharpening I do and the intensity of sharpening, they actually serve me very, very well, and honestly better than anything I've used before, and that's why I use them. I'm really a user of these stones. I don't make them, but I definitely do use them a lot. So I'm going to go on to a 400 grit stone now and kind of answer the question that Jonathan had. But that's kind of how I like to leave my stones, like this. It just helps me. It's also when I go to start sharpening the next day or another series I'm doing or another batch of knives. But let's move on to a 400 grit now. So today I decided to bring a 400, the Hakto 1, just for comparison. So I haven't actually, this is a stone that I'm using a few days ago, just so you know, like that's how it looks after I've used it. So Jonathan was asking about loaded and versus unloaded and the cutting speed. So let's actually go on to the Honyaki again, because that'll load it up quite fast. Yamano. So, well, I'm going to go back onto this Honyaki again. It's Tatsuto Yamano's Tamahagane Honyaki. And we'll go slightly on a different angle and erase a few of these scratches that we created. And we'll load the stone up, and then I'll show you how to maintain the stone. So let's go on a slightly longer way. You can see it's really aggressive right now. That's really aggressive. In the area, not sure if you can get this on the camera, but that's the 400 grit, and this is the 200 grit from before. So that's how fast it erased the 200 grit scratches. You guys can see that's the 400, and then there's a little bit left here of the 200. Oh yeah, here you go. That's the 200, and this is the new 400. So this 400 Hocto 1S, S for being a little bit softer, it is softer. The reason I use it is really for shaping blades like this, where at 400 grit stage, I'm really fine-tuning the shaping. So after you've been sharpening a while, and maybe the 400 is probably not the best to show this on. When we move to the probably 8 or 12, we can, or 1500 stone, we can actually show this better. But you can see how well this stone cuts at 400 grit. Absolutely no issues whatsoever, removing the scratches really fast. And then what I just do naturally, I'll take the 200, this large brick. Just quickly maintain a bit of flatness. And I find that the 120 surface doesn't really affect the sharpening a lot. I'll talk a little bit about that as I move to the finer stones. A few other things you can do on the 400 grit is you can use the NSK, let's see if I have one here, 400. Oh, I don't have one. I thought I brought a 400, but it turned out to be a 4000. But what you can do with NSK, there are Nagura for most of the bridging all of the stone grit ranges together. So there's 400, 800, and then 3000, 4000, 10,000. So the other thing you can do during sharpening, if you find the stones loading up, is you can actually just make a light mud on the stone. And then go to sharpening this. And this helps to refresh the surface and the pores of the stone. And for the harder stones that are finer, it really helps give a really nice cutting surface. So that's kind of how the 400 looks. It's very aggressive, really, really nice stone to work with. So we're going to move on to the 800 now. Just reading a question here, W. When you do edge sharpening, do you like to use a lot of pressure as well, or rather do you let the stone do the work? A lot of sharpeners debate on the whole pressure debate. What are your thoughts? I tend to, for edge sharpening, I tend to not use a lot of pressure. Another thing that I have been doing for a very long time is that I only get a burr on my first rough stone. After that, I don't make a burr again. I find you're just wasting steel, and people can argue that, but just the way I've been doing it for a long time. I tended to be doing blades that have no edge, prior edge on it. So I don't tend to use a lot of pressure after my first rough stone, which Often would be a 400 grit that I usually start my edge sharpening at. So I don't tend to use a lot of pressure, and I dissipate the pressure as I move through the stones up into the polishing stones. So a typical quick edge sharpening progression that a lot of people use in Sakai is 400, 1,000, and 3,000. And for 400, you get your burr there. That's where your pressure would be. Then the 1,000 and the 3,000, very light pressure, no burr. All you're working on is maintaining that, getting as fine as edge as you can. Okay, now we're going to move on to an 800 grit stone. So I brought two different stones here. I brought the Hakuto 800 and the Oboro Bocho 800. So I thought it'd be interesting to compare them. So I'm going to actually use this kaiju to test these two. So soft iron, obviously, and I believe this is a white one. So let's go on to the Hakuto 800 first. A little bit softer, slightly softer, but very, very pure, very fine 800 grit stone, which is just, for me, for polishing, amazing, just really amazing. So again, I've maintained these stones so I know they're flat. During the sharpening process, I'll show you how I kind of maintain the flatness. Again, most of the time on knives like this, I tend to work on the spine first. I don't want to see I want a crisp spine, but I also want very, very clean. I don't want to see any small scratches up there, which I've seen on other people's work. Sometimes they neglect the spine. So I tend to get that out of the way first. So you can see with the stone, it's got a kind of milky, muddy, grayish color. That's because it is a little bit softer, and obviously I'm working on the soft iron as well. Cuts very fast. Let's go down onto the steel now. You can see the color changes but you can see just how fast this stone cuts. And quickly starting to remove the previous scratches that were actually the 400 NSK. So let's go on to the 800 Oboro and see how they compare. The grit ranges are both 800, but I find this 800 Hakuto feels finer. Hard to say why, but has a really fine, refined feeling, much more refined. So this stone I actually left slightly used because I wanted to show you guys just kind of how I maintain the flatness using a few other of the tools that we have here today. So before I start sharpening, Rock Chop Knife Co. asks, may I add that in the past I've had issues with the unwanted grit from conditioning flattening. With NSK, I have no issues with air bubbles or other defects that can trap these particles. Really interesting observation there. Yeah, I find myself, I don't have any real issues with cross-contamination with other grits or anything getting stuck into the stones or particles being trapped or anything. I find they're very clean to work with, which is really important for people doing polishing, because scratches for polishes are our worst nightmare. So as you can see, this is stone is worn a bit. I think I was doing honyaki on this, a little bit worn here. I maintained it a bit here. So I'm just going to actually go quickly through how I would maintain and flatten this using the glass plate. So this is a great tool to have. And these glass plates that are sold by Koman are actually tempered glass. They tend to wear very slowly, and the hardness and the flatness is excellent. And I've tested the flatness with a straight edge, and I test everything with the straight edge, to even while I'm using stuff and during and after and months, just to see the wear of stuff. And these have been excellent to use. So how I use this to flatten and maintain the stone is pretty easy. You can do this in a few different ways, but I just take one of the 120 brick, and you can just get a bit of the abrasive right onto the plate, or you can put it onto the stone like this. Either ways works great. And then just what's really interesting about these glass plates that I've noticed that I can use them for is, when you get the glass plates, obviously it's glass, it's clear, there's no scratches, they don't look hazy like this. Okay, they don't look hazy like this. From using the 120 grit stones on these plates and the grit, it actually creates this kind of, I guess, matte look. But actually what happens is they do impart a grit into the plate. And this is actually a really cool thing, because without, and I'll get into this when we get into the 1500 stone, but without any grit on the plate, just the abrasive that's been imparted into the plate, so it's clean, there's nothing on here right now. You can see, I believe this is because I'm tempered, it's tempered, it holds it, maybe not, but at 800 grit, the 800 grit actually doesn't need anything to flatten it on the plate. Just an interesting observation. And I find that it's really great for when you're moving up into your finer stones. So let's go and check out how the Oboro differs from the Hakuto. So I'm going to go into the hard steel. So it's very different stone. It leaves a slightly brighter steel, a little bit different on the cladding, a little bit more aggressive stone. Let's go on to the cladding. not as muddy as the Hakuto. But very useful for Sanmai, the Oboro knife series. I find it cuts the carbon really well and is very, very different from the Hakuto, which again feels finer to me, more refined, even though they're actually very similar 800 abrasive, diamond abrasive. So I'm going to move on to the 1500 now. Blue Steel 991 asks, hello Ivan, don't mind me asking, but with the foundation sharpening polishing being so important, is there a super hard, slow wearing NSK which people can use almost indefinitely? When I first started working with NSK, testing their stones, there actually were no anything lower than 400 grit. 400 grit was their lowest stone. So I immediately asked them, hey, let's start making a 200 grit stone because that's so useful for foundation work. So the hardest stones currently, I guess, would be the ones that are offered. The 200 Oboro and the 200 Hakuto. Super hard that can last indefinitely. If I think I understand what you're talking about, unfortunately, I don't know of any stones that can last indefinitely. If there were, that would be pretty amazing. But yeah, it really depends. It's difficult to say. Yeah, currently those are the stones in the lineup. So they work very well for me for foundation work, doing all, as you see, all different styles of blades and types of steel. So the next stone I'm going to go on to is a 1500 stone. And I think this can actually cover what Jonathan was asking, a loaded stone versus a non-loaded stone and how it performs. So again, this is a stone that I had been using and maintained. I think on this stone, I'm actually going to go for the, let's go on the Yanagiba. So I'm just going to go on to the Yanagiba with this 1500. So this is a Fujiyama, older Fujiyama white 2 Yanagiba. And I use this actually for testing stones, actually. That's the main use for it. I've had it for quite some time. So a few things about the progression and kind of how the stones change as we move on. The 200, 400, and the 800, all those stones can actually be fairly maintained with all the tools that we were using before, the glass plate, the 120 bricks, the large one and the small one, as well as if you don't have these things and you like using but from 1,500 moving up, how do you maintain the 1,500 and up grit ranges is very different from the previous grit ranges. The reason why is I find that the the surface of the stone needs to be maintained at least to 1000 grit. Anything lower than that tends to they don't perform at their peak. So how I prepare these stones is, again, I'll flatten the stone using often a 400 NSK 400. The 400 grit flattener. And I'll just prepare the stone first with this. Once I've prepared the stone with the 400, then I'll move on to a 1000 grit flattener. As you can see, this one's quite well worn, but still works extremely well for this purpose. So I like to get, one thing you don't want on the 1000 grit stone and any of the stones that are above 1500 grit is you don't want any deep scratches. I'm not sure what it is, but I just find with polishing at these harder, finer stones that the surface also needs to be very fine and very well maintained. So I'll get this surface really smooth, really clean. I always like to really inspect it, clean it, flush it. And you can do a few things. You can use the Nagura on this. We made the 3000 grit Nagura on here, which is really unique. What it does is it kind of accentuates the fineness of this stone, but also gives you a bit of the 3000 grit, and it just helps you to flush the stone and maintain it during sharpening. If you find you're having problems with the type of steel or the cladding that you're working with. But I'm going to go straight stone and water right now. You can see how fast the stone cuts. It immediately starts working. So this is what we were talking about earlier, is this buildup of carbon into the stone. So you can maintain this a few different ways. One is by refreshing it with a Nagura, which I'll show you. So I'll use the 3000 grit Nagura here. Yeah, and I like to keep everything rounded, no corners. I just find that the reason why is I don't like any particles coming off or chipping or anything like that. So everything is rounded all the time. So the stone is not used much, so I don't really need to worry about flatness. So I can easily make a mud on the stone. Now you can choose to clean this. It's at 3000 grit, so you can easily leave it on there. So let's work the stone with the mud on there and see kind of what results we get. And at this stage, we're not using a lot of pressure like the lower grit stones. What we're doing really right now is really fine-tuning, smoothing, polishing. So you see with the use of the Nagura, you don't get much buildup at all. And that works also on with the 400 and the 800. And then if we go back to straight water, it's a very, very different experience and used for different reasons. Why I would choose to use only water on the stone is because I really want to see clearly the scratches are being removed. I want to see the scratches from the 800, which is the previous stone. I want to see them clearly being removed. So if the stone is muddy or there's mud on there, it tends to cloud the blade that you're sharpening. And at this stage, we're not really looking for anything to be pretty. What we're looking for is that our results, because we want to quickly go through all this to get to the fun stuff, which is the polishing on natural stones. I think everybody can agree with that. So this stuff is really, this process and all of this work that I do is really to get to polishing on natural stones, the final stage. Just going to look at a couple questions here. Mr. Easy, does the cutting speed of NSK 200 grit stone exceed that of Dabato 180? Yes, I believe it does. I've tried that stone and I feel it does. And Mr. Easy also asks, and in your opinion, what would be the basic starting set of NSK for polishing progression? For a polishing progression, I mean, obviously 200, 400, 800, and the 1,500. I think as a base, that's great. I find it really depends on what type of steel you're working with. I do a lot of honyaki. So for me, I know everybody can't have both, but I tend to like having both hakuto and oboro. I guess it's much easier for me when I'm going through different types of steel, different blacksmiths, to be able to have the option. But I know if there's no option, probably I would start with the 200 oboro, the 400 oboro, and it's hard to say between the 800 and the 800 hakuto and the 800 oboro. Actually, I like both stones a lot. But as a series, probably if you stay with just the oboro, you'd be fine. And then throw the 1,500 in there, I think is a great starting point. After the 1,500, you can really kind of go anywhere you want, use other types of stones that you like. I'll talk a bit about this as we get past this 1,500. So again, just to really reiterate about this stone, if it's not maintained well, you don't get the best performance from it. Unlike the other stones where really keeping the corners around and maintaining the dressing of it with these bricks, it's pretty straightforward and very easy to do. But really this stone I find really works extremely well when it's maintained very well. And I've found it works so well that actually I can go from this stone directly to a natural chunagura, which I've actually really never been able to do before on synthetic stones in this grit range. So something special, really special about this stone. It is a bit softer because of the Hokuto series is slightly softer, but it really has its advantages. And one of the stones I can't live without, this stone. So I'm going to go on now to a 3000 grit stone. The maintenance of it is very similar to this, but it's quite a soft stone, but I do use it quite frequently as well. So there's two different types of stone that I'm going to look at right now. And they're slightly, and I'm just going to talk a bit about this grit range. So after 1,500, when you removed all the scratches from your 800 or the previous stone, you're going to get into a kind of type of sharpening, which has been always really difficult for me, and that is transitioning from the lower grit range stones into polishing. On the market, I've tried so many stones. I've tried stones from, I've tried diamond stones. I've tried from many companies in Japan. I've even tried custom-made stones in Japan that are in the, say, 2,000 to 4,000 grit range. And unfortunately, I've never, ever been happy. And I know there's other people out there probably that feel the same ways, that there's nothing on the market that works really, really well and that's solid and that can cover different types of steel. So that 1,500 is an excellent stepping stone into this grit range because it's very fine. It removes the scratches very well from the previous stones, but also sets the blade up to go on to this grit range, which is very important. So what I have here is a 2,000 grit Oboro Bocho series, which is a considerably harder stone. And the other one I have is a very, very soft Hokuto 2 3000S. Like the 1,500 grit stone, the surface needs to be maintained really well, at least at 1,000 grit. So I really tend to like to use these 1,000 grit dressing stones. The surface that they impart on these is really worth their weight in gold. There are other ways you could do it. You could maintain it with a 400 grit. If what you have is a 400 grit flattener or no flattener at all, and maybe all you have is these bricks. I'm not sure what everybody has, what they like to use. But you can also resurface these stones from a lower grit stone with the wafers. You can, and these come in 300, 200, 300, 600, and 1,000. I'm not sure exactly, but something like that. They come with the stones as well. So these can be used to resurface from a lower grit stone to get rid of the deep scratches. And then you can use a Nagura to get the fine finish on these polishing stones. And that tends to be able to set the stones up really nicely. One of the reasons why I like to use these dressing stones specifically for the finer stones is they're very versatile. You can easily round the corners with them, round everything. You don't get any chipping, and it really smooths out the corners and rounds the corners, which is so important for polishing. So with these stones, they're very soft, pretty much the same way I use them. You can see how the water actually evaporates into this stone. It's quite soft for a diamond stone, but it's such a nice stone to use. And it's really a great medium grit stone that can help you to go straight into polishing. And you can see the black, how nice it is. if you use this with a Nagura, which is really interesting, what happens is you can actually create a really nice kasumi finish just with the NSK stone. So next one I'm just going to test here is the 2000 Oboro Bocho stone, just so you can see a bit of a difference. And then I'll just give a quick why I choose to use these stones. So what I really like about this stone is the hard surface, but also the fact that it leaves no kasumi finish whatsoever. And you can see, let me just get a little bit more. This is just so important when you're polishing, because you just want to see that you have removed the scratches. So this is really what I'm looking for from a 2000 grit stone, and why I use the Oboro 2000 grit stone is because it starts to erase all of the kasumi. And if we go further, using a lot of water on the stone, you don't get any mud buildup, really just cutting. And when you're doing single bevel honyaki specifically, this stone is really incredible. And that's why the difference why I use these two type of stones, one very soft, one very hard. Evan from Strata, do you sharpen in silence? Actually, no, I don't. I actually listen to music almost all the time. The only time where I'm really sharpening in silence is when I'm actually doing the spine of tamahagane blades. The reason why is the concentration level to get those angles. I can quickly just tell you why this is, but let me grab a 200. So most everything, all the other sharpening I'm doing is, for me, pretty routine. I've done it for a long time. I know what I'm doing. I don't really need to hear anything. I can even sometimes just not even look at times, not all the time, but sometimes. But specifically, I don't listen to music. I don't listen to anything. And when I have to do spine work, and because I need to have absolute concentration. So what I mean by spine on tamahagane kitchen knives that we get from Yamano that we work with is sometimes there's 3 sides, sometimes there's 2 sides. I don't know if you can see this, but this particular one has 3. So 1, 2, and then flat down the center. Maybe you can see from here. So the way traditionally you do this is you hold the angle like this, you get your angle. Usually I have a little bit higher surface. You get your angle. Once you've held your angle, you lock it in. So there's a certain sound and a certain feeling that lets you know that you're hitting that surface perfectly. And sometimes the stone makes slightly different sounds when you go off. So that's why I do that particular work with no music. So back to these 2 stones. Yeah, they really have their very, very different uses, and that's kind of why I use them. The 2000 and the 3000 grit stone, the 2000 Oboro Bocho, and the 3000 Hokuto 2S. There is, of course, a Hokuto 1 3000 and a Hokuto 2 and a Hokuto 2S 3000, which is this one. I tend to use the softer one for blending. of hamaguri stuff that I'm doing with tamahagane work. I find it works really well. And both stones, if you choose the right natural stone, easily transition from this to natural stones. So after these stones, I often tend from these stones to go right into natural stones. The other stones that I often will use, though, are this 12,000 grit stone, which is extremely soft, but very, very fine, leaves a great mirror polish. And I use this very, very specifically only for ura work on single bevel knives. I think it's absolutely incredible for it. And the other stones, there's obviously 3,000, there's 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000. But I tend to really use these stones. This range from 200 to 3,000. That's the range I tend to use the most. Other than that, that's pretty much how I maintain everything. We don't have a lot of time today, so we can always cover this or sections of this at another time. Just kind of wanted to give an introduction of this. So what I want to do now, though, quickly is go through some of the questions that we got, because they're actually really interesting. I think I may have touched on them a bit, but let's go through them again. So the first question, Roberto Bacci, are they worth the price? This is a question I get all the time. And again, it's really hard to answer. But I will say that you really have to weigh, I guess, your budget with the work you're doing. And are you a professional? Is it a hobby? What do you really need the stones for? I'm a professional, so for me, I'm doing honyaki knives a lot, or other work I'm doing like kaiju or things like that, or custom work. So I'm looking most of the time for me, I'm always searching for the best possible finish and best possible experience with a stone for my technique. So I try to really, I try to look at the stone like that. So for me, they really are worth the wait. They really are worth the price. They really are worth it. But you really have to really determine on where you are in your sharpening and where you want to go. I think that's a really important question to ask yourself as a sharpener, whether you're a professional or not. It's just a great way to approach sharpening. The next question, best way to increase the speed. We kind of covered this with the Oboro or any of the NSK Kogyo knives. Really just using these bricks to increase the cutting speed. They're 120. I have tried 220. I've tried other types of abrasive. These are all silicon carbide, tends to be the best. They tend to abrade the bond of the stone, but also bring back the cutting speed without bothering the diamond abrasive. Another question from Evan from Strata. When you switch to natural stones, do you decrease or increase grit? I think I know what you mean. What I mean by that is, for example, Chunagura is around, most Chunagura, depending which ones you buy, it's a natural stone, so they're all very different. But I'll try to finish at a 3,000 or 2,000 grit, and then the Chunagura tend to be slightly lower than that. So I'll go high and drop low. If I want to go straight to a Suita or Hira Suita, I'll go maybe to 6,000 grit or around 3,000 grit, and then I'll drop to a Suita that I know, or Uchigimori that I know is around 3,000 to 4,000 grit range. It's hard, there's no range for natural stones, but that's, I think, what you mean, Evan, and that's how I do it. I always go high and then low. I find that's best for my polishing work. Another question here. Rodrigo Batista, is there a height due to keeping enough room for fingers and knuckles away from surfaces the stone might places on while one is going back and forth when strokes? I've actually never really thought about that and never really had a problem with that. I tend to, when I'm sharpening, tend to keep a block of wood and raise it up. So I tend to keep the stone very raised and central. So my hands are really never, my knuckles or nothing's really touching the stone. For example, like when I'm sharpening, my fingers are always on the stone, on the blade. I never put them here because you're going to actually ruin the geometry. I've seen this happen a lot. So I keep my hands always on the stone, this hand always on the stone wherever I am. I don't go off the stone with the pressure. This hand is always here. I don't hit the stone. If I can, for something like this, a yanagiba, if I'm actually moving towards the stone, actually I back off here, or I come back here. So quick to show what I mean. If I have this grip here, but I want to hit the corner, hit the back here of the heel, then I'll come to this position, then I'll come back to this position. So I'm always moving around, negotiating where I need to be on the stone for the type of pressure and the area that needs to be sharpening. So yeah, personally, I never run into that problem. But yeah, really interesting question. Thanks for asking that. I've never thought about it before. So I'm going to go back to some of the other questions we got. From old woodwork, what knife type, shape, steel, size is best for learning geometry and polishing? It's a great question. First, I would say I see. Okay, thank you. You meant, just to go back to this question again, Rodrigo Batista, he meant the base height. Yeah, I keep my base height of actually keep a block of wood. I don't have it here because we're in a different location, but I keep a block of wood to keep the height around this area of me. So I don't have to move over and I can get a lot of grip and pressure. I don't keep the stone very low like this is here. So, and with that block, it gives me a lot of space and room. So I'm never running into anything with my hands. Well, thanks again for that question. So back to the other question. Yeah, what type of knife to start to learn on? I wouldn't go with something too cheap, actually, because if you go with something really cheap, you're going to run into issues with the blade not being straight, and it needs to be straightened. If you don't have experience straightening it, that can sometimes be challenging. So I would go with a fairly neutral blade, like that's not too expensive, but not too cheap. A blade that maybe other people have used. One thing I would do is go for a wide bevel kurochi. That's actually easy to work with. Sometimes if you're doing, starting with a single bevel knife, the shinogi line is very, very difficult to negotiate and engage with. Often the blade is twisted or bent, and those things sometimes can't be taken out. They're set in the blade even by the sharpeners. So a kurochi blade with a shinogi line, a rough shinogi line, I think is a really nice place to start. I would start with a gyuto. Sometimes pedi or santoku or other shapes can be a little bit difficult to actually get the shape correct. So a gyuto tends to be nice to start with. Steel, yeah, carbon steel, basic carbon steel, white 1, white 2 is a nice place to start, blue 2. Again, not too expensive, basic carbon steel. Really just try to get a knife that is, you really don't really have a real worry about ruining it. And why I say kurochi is because if you go up into the kurochi and break that area from the kurochi into the blade road, it's not such a big deal. It doesn't look so bad, and you're not really ruining the performance of the blade like with a Yanagiba. So I think that's where I would start. Another question from Rock Chop Knife Co. I set myself up with the Oboro 200, 400, 800. Which stones would you recommend if I were to add another 3 to my set? I work on various types of steel. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I see all the stuff you do. Really beautiful work. Yeah, really, really, really impressive stuff. I would actually get the 1500, looking at what you do. I think you would really enjoy that stone. Maybe one of the 3000 I would also put in there. I do like the 2000 grit Oboro Bocho. I think it's a great transition stone into the finer grit stones. It's aggressive, so it's really very, very different. But I think the 1500, a Hakuto 3000, and the Oboro Bocho 2000 would be a great next way to go with your stones. And we're going to go 1 or 2 more questions here. Usually diamond stones leave deep scratches. Is it a problem when moving to natural stone polishing? That's actually a really interesting question, and something I always think about a lot. It can be a problem because a lot of the times, not only diamond stones, but other synthetic stones leave much deeper scratches, depth of scratch into your steel, into the blade, than natural stones as they cut. Natural stones tend to cut more shallow. So there can be a problem. But what I found with the NSK diamond stones particularly is that because one, the grit is very, very pure. And as you progress finer and finer, if you understand your natural stones that you want to progress, and you understand the grit range that they're in and how fast they cut and the depth that they cut at, natural stones, then it's easy to progress and choose which diamond stone, for me personally, which stone I'm going to use to progress. So what I mentioned before is I've had no problem going from the 1500 Hakuto 1 and going straight to a natural Chunagura, which tend to be around 1500 to 2000, 2500. Difficult to tell which stone, but that's kind of the grit range. And I've had no problems. And I've also gone from the 3000 grit Hakuto series right to Uchigamori. So I personally have never had that problem. I can understand the issue and why the question, and I think it's a great question, but I personally don't have that problem with NSK, with diamond stones. But I think that's all our questions for today, and we're gonna wrap it up here. Really, this was really an overview, and I hope it was really interesting for everybody. Some things can't really spend too much time on. Hopefully we can get to it in another time, another day. But I really appreciate everybody's support and what everybody's doing in their own personal work. It's really incredible to see. So thank you so much, everybody. And really great chatting with everybody and answering these really interesting questions. And thanks for following us. Follow Komon Japan. Thank you for using NSK stones, and we'll see you soon. Take care, guys. Bye.